Namaskar, and today we shall look at another book published by the Center for Policy Studies about India. The title of the book is Timeless India, Resurgent India, Recollecting the Greatness and Grandeur of Indian Civilization. The book was published in 2001, and I consider this book as a very informative book about the real greatness of India. See, we have had a civilization which yielded very rich results both materially and spiritually. The material abundance of India was so striking that it attracted invaders waves after waves for 1,000 years, and even so, even after all the loot, all the destruction, India still survived and India is still rich. It is during the British period that huge amount of Indian wealth was siphoned off outside the country, and therefore India suffered very grievously, and its physical existence was threatened. Large number of people died under famines. The famines became a very frequent visitor to India and took a toll of millions of people. As I had recalled earlier also, that some historian has compiled some data, and he said the first 330 years of the Pathan invasion, that is the sultans of Delhi after Muhammad Ghori, Qutbuddin Aibak, then Tughlaq, Lodi, Khilji, all these people until the Mughals came, until Babur came in 1526. So 1192 to 1526, something like 333 years. Something like 8 crores of people perished because of the invasion. This number may be on both sides, but the invaders were in a minuscule minority. So essentially, the bulk of these 8 crores are people, not merely soldiers, but people, ordinary people. Because the wars were taken to the houses. It was not confined to the war front as it was at the time of Mahabharata or so. Only in Kurukshetra the war will be fought. It was not like that. The wars were fought in the houses, in the temples, in villages. So a huge number of people perished, 8 crores, he says, in 333 years. But if you compare it to the British time, it was less strife torn during the British time, even though, I said less, only less, even though there were 111 wars in the 100 years of the 19th century. 111 wars the British waged in India. And most of these wars were fought by Indians on the side of the British. So the casualties were between Indians and Indians. But apart from that, these famines took a very heavy toll, running into crores. It was not less than the earlier period I mentioned. The rate of death was not less than that. This is obscured from our vision because of our history. The history as it is written and as we read it in our books, these are not shown. But the reality is that India suffered a huge toll in terms of human resources and also material resources. The material resources caused the human resource depletion. Huge amount of money was siphoned away systematically from India to outside India, that is to Britain, and the Britain became one of the richest countries in the world. It was certainly one of the most prominent countries in the world during the 19th century. And there are British authors who have written, very serious authors, that the Industrial Revolution of Britain, 1770 to 1830, that is the period they are talking about, 1760 to 1830, that is the period. The Industrial Revolution was funded by the wealth stolen from India. Yeah, but that was the British period, and by the time we regained our freedom in 1947, the literacy rate in India had depleted so much that it had come down to something like 4%. And India was one of the poorest countries in the world. And when poverty and illiteracy combined affects a society, it corrodes it from the very core. And corruption was a natural outcome of this. Diffidence was a natural outcome of this. So India was diffident and India was corrupt, and it was visited by disease, and the illiteracy continued for a while. But slowly, India realized that what need to be done, and as it took measures of correction, India started gaining its confidence back. And today we see an India which is poised for a resurgence, which will certainly make it one of the top-notch countries in the world, and its people, happy people in terms of food and education. The daily chores will always be there, the problems will be there, but India can ward off poverty and illiteracy, which will give it great confidence. At this juncture, it may be very worthwhile to just revisit what our country has been over centuries. What are its essential strengths, and where can we bank upon? What fabric can we lean upon so to reconstruct our society? Therefore, I thought that we should make a presentation on this. It is only one part, single part, and it will have some 5-6 subheadings. Let me go into the book. Published by the Center for Policy Studies, which has an express goal of rejuvenating India. We have seen the earlier book, the Annam Bahukuruvita, was written by the same authors. Indian civilization has a long history. This is the preface of the book. Indian civilization has a long history, perhaps the longest amongst the great civilizations of the world. We can say this on the authority of Will Durant, the American historian. The mountains, rivers, soils, and sunshine of India are all unique in themselves. Early observers and geographers have always described these in superlative terms. And the wisdom of India, her inborn and deeply ingrained discipline of according dignity and divinity to all aspects of creation, and perpetually endeavoring to maintain harmony amongst all of them, is so unique that several other great civilizations of the world have revered India as a great teacher. This comes from the perspective on life, which we call as the paradigm, and India stands as a model on the spiritual paradigm. The offshoot of that model, offshoot of this perspective, is the civilization which looks at the whole of creation as divine. The people of India gratefully accepted this divine bounty of wealth and wisdom and have diligently and dutifully built a civilization that almost throughout her history has been renowned for her material and cultural riches. This exhibition is designed to help us to recollect this greatness and grandeur of India. That is the purpose of the book. First, we will look at the natural structure of India, the bounty given by God upon this India. It's a vast and a rich land. From the northern borders of Kashmir to the southernmost tip at Kanyakumari, our land extends over 3,200 kilometers. It's from north to south. And east to west, it is 3,500 kilometers. The total area of what has historically constituted India is 423 million hectares. It's talking about historically constituted means it includes the present day Pakistan and Bangladesh. Of this, about 94 million hectares today fall under Pakistan and Bangladesh, and 329 million hectares in the Indian Union. In terms of area, India today is the 8th largest region in the world. After the Russian Federation is 1,708 million hectares, as India is 329 million hectares. After the Russian Federation, China, which is about 2.5 to 3 times larger than India, USA and territories, certainly 3 times more than India, Canada, which is also roughly about 3 times, Brazil, Australia, Western Europe. But that does not mean that the Indian land is 8th in value. On the contrary, India is one of the richest regions of the world. In terms of cultivable area, India is in fact the best endowed country in the world. 3/5 of our geographical area is cultivable. 3/5. That means 60% of our area is cultivable. No other country in the world has this ratio of cultivable, it can boast of this kind of a ratio of cultivable land. No other country. In most other valuable regions of the world, no more than 1/5 of the lands are cultivable. Look at China, even look at USA. Vast stretches of USA are desert. India is the richest region in the world. The Indian region, when we say Indian region, we mean the subcontinent, including Pakistan, because Pakistan is certainly one of the richest landmass in the world. The Indian region commands 190 million hectares of cultivable land, of which 160 million hectares are in the Indian Union. Cultivable area of USA is 177 million hectares, marginally better than us, that is the present day India. So not better than the Indian subcontinent. USA is 177 million hectares. That of the Russian Federation is 126 million hectares. China is 124. Western Europe is 77. Australia is 56. Brazil is 53 million hectares. India, it not only has larger cultivable area than all other great regions of the world, Indian lands are also the most fertile. And the compact geography of India has always been described in superlative terms by visitors from outside. Here is a chart which I have already quoted, therefore I'll skip this. One of the finest things for India is the protection afforded by the Himalayas. This is a quote from Kalidasa, the great Indian poet who lived about 2000 years ago. He says, Asti Uttarasyam Dishi Devatatma. In the northern side, Uttarasyam Dishi. Asti Uttarasyam Dishi Devatatma Himalayo Nama Nagadhirajaha. The king of mountains. Purvaparau Toyanidhi Bhagahya Sthita Prithivya Ivamanadandaha. The northern boundary stands the Himalayas, the king of mountains, raising his crown to the heavens, the abode of gods, extending both his arms to the east and west, dipping his hands into the seas as if to measure the size of the earth. Prithivya Ivamanadandaha. So this Himalaya is a great boon upon India from several counts. The key to India's peculiar and extraordinary fertility lies in the Himalayan ranges, which are about 250 to 400 kilometers wide. This roof of the world stretches for about 2,400 kilometers across the north of India. It boasts of the three highest points on the Earth's surface. Gauri Shankar, known as Mount Everest today, at 29,141 feet. Kanchenjunga, 28,150 feet. There are 50 Himalayan summits of 25,000 feet and above. The Himalayan range has an average elevation of 19,000 feet. Indian landmass in his outstretched arms. Geographically, Himalayas belong to Tibet as to India, but their bounty is reserved entirely for India. All the rain that falls and all the snow that melts, whether on the northern or southern flanks of the Himalayas, is poured into India. It is Himalaya which causes the clouds to rise because of the winds, and it is the Himalayas which makes the clouds to pour onto India. On this fertile land, Himalaya causes this bounty of rains. And it has reserved it for India. That's what the author says. Tibet doesn't get any. Even the northern flakes of Himalaya, whatever the ice melts, bulk of it flows through Brahmaputra and also to Sindhu. The waters that the Himalayas pour into India through the three great Himalayan rivers, Sindhu, Ganga and Brahmaputra, and their tributaries, bring with them large quantities of life-giving silt. See, he's not talking about water, he's talking about a silt that comes from Himalaya. The Sindhu-Ganga plain, the most fertile area of its size in the world, is formed by the silt of the Himalayas. The Sindhu-Ganga plain is noted for its antiquity, size, fertility, depth, and flatness. It extends from the Sindhu Delta in the west to the Ganga Delta in the east. By delta, we mean the area where the rivers meet the sea. The entire plain, some 3,000 kilometers long and 250 to 400 kilometers wide, is alluvial. The plain covers about a fifth of the geographical area of India, and the whole of it is cultivable. In fact, the soil is so rich. Let me quote an American scholar. He wrote this in 1947, predicting India's future, a glorious future. He says, a great part of its soil is renewed every year by floods. And the mud brought down from the hills is so fine that it is reputedly possible to traverse the entire length of the plain without finding a pebble, however small. This is the observation, is under quotes, without finding a pebble. It is quoted from a traveler a century earlier who traveled from Attock to Cuttack. He said he did not have to touch a pebble on the route, leave alone rocks. The land is so alluvial and so fertile. And you know that if you dig a little, maybe 6 feet, 8 feet, you will find water. I'm talking about the entire Ganga plain. It is as if this whole platform is floating upon Ganga. The alluvium, in addition to being remarkably uniform over its entire extent of approximately 80 million hectares, is extremely thick. The exact thickness has never been ascertained, but borings have penetrated it to a depth of 1,300 feet without reaching the rocky bottom. Usually 100 feet, 200 feet, you will find the rocks. But this is 1,300 feet without reaching a rocky bottom. The plain is also exceptionally flat. It has not a hill, not even a mound to break the monotony of the level surface. If you are visiting the North India for the first time, you will really get bored. I traveled from here to Kanpur some 35 years ago as a student, but then when I mounted a train from Jhansi and was traveling towards Kanpur, it's about 4.5 hours journey, I could experience this, and not a mound. So the entire land looks so flat, and you don't have any specific identity for any specific place. I come from a coastal region where every nook and corner has an identity of its own, because there is a hillock and there is a valley and there is a plateau, all kinds of things were there spread out. But here it is extremely plain. Agra, halfway between the two deltas, is more than 2,000 kilometers by river from the sea. By Ganga, if you travel, it is 2,000 kilometers. It is only 550 feet above sea level. This flatness makes the rivers flow slowly, thus fertilizing the country thoroughly and affording easy waterways and irrigation channels. There are no rapids. Unlike in some of the rivers in the US, there are rapids. You cannot really navigate through those rapids. Whereas this entire Ganga is in the plains, of course not in the mountains, but in the plain, is navigable through ship, through boats, because it is so flat. The land is so flat. This is one of the world's greatest expanses of rich, tillable soil, and thus one of the world's greatest agricultural regions. And therefore, it housed or this hosted a great civilization. The plain in the west, called Konkan, in its upper and Malabar in its lower part, is relatively narrow, averaging about 70 kilometers in width. The plain in the east, covering Kalinga, Andhra, and Cholamandalam. Cholamandalam in the south, Kalinga in the north. Regions from the north to the south is broader and is endowed with the fertile deltas of several rivers flowing across the broad Deccan Plateau. There is Godavari, there is Mahanadi, there is Kaveri. These two coastal plains contain almost 40 million hectares of land, all of which is cultivable. The Sindhu-Ganga plain and the two coastal plains together thus encompass 1/3 of the geographical area and 2/3 of the cultivable area of the Indian region. All of this area is highly fertile. Most of the remaining cultivable land lies in the Deccan Plateau, which rises from 1,000 to 2,000 feet above sea level and is broken up into many river valleys and hills. The black cotton soil of the northwestern part of the plateau and the river valleys are fertile, though not as rich as the alluvial plains. And Ganga, Mother Ganga. From Gangotri to Ganga Sagar, the Ganga flows over a distance of 2,525 kilometers. The average flow of Ganga is 38,000 cubic meters per second, making it the third amongst the greatest rivers of the world, after only the Amazon in South America and the Congo in Africa. The Ganga brings 360 million tons of the Himalayan silt every year to the great Indian plains. Only the Huanghe, which is almost a river of mud, and the Mississippi and Changjiang in China carry more silt. The Ganga is great not merely in statistics. The river flows slowly and gracefully through the entire heartland of India, steadily endowing it with fertilizing silt and life-giving water. This life-giving water is not only during the rainy season, but also during the summer, because the snow in the Himalaya melts and feeds these rivers. This is the secret of the great fertility of Indian plains. The heartland of India is born of the Ganga, and the Ganga has nurtured it for uncounted millennia. And there are other rivers, Yamuna, Godavari, Kaveri, etc. Great rivers give rise to great civilizations. Most major civilizations of the world have sprung around some single great river. Egypt rose on the banks of Nile. Mesopotamia rose on Euphrates, Tigris. Europe on the Danube. India on the Ganga, the Sindhu, the Saraswati, Brahmaputra, Narmada, Tapati, Mahanadi, Godavari, Krishna, Kaveri, etc., etc. And Indians do remember this in their Pratasmarana. They give tribute to these rivers. They call it Mokshadayini. Tirtha, they call it Tirtha. And during the rainy seasons, Indians call it the Varshakal. In the 4 months of the Varshakal, India obtains 90% of the total rain. Almost every part of India is drenched in the bounty, barring parts of Sindhu plain and southern part of the eastern coast which receive scanty rain. Part of Sindhu rain means the desert in Rajputana, etc. The Himalayas play a crucial role in making the rain winds rise and then forcing them to exhaust their entire moisture over India. Average annual rainfall in the Indian region amounts to 105 centimeters, which is the largest anywhere in the world for a country of comparable size. Compare it with China, it has 63 centimeters average. The rains pour a total of 4,500 billion cubic meters of water over the Indian region. The USA, with about 2.5 times the geographical area of Indian region that is, receives the same amount of water, 4,500 billion cubic meters. And the China, with a geographical area twice as that of Indian subcontinent, receives about 6,000 billion cubic meters, which is 30% more than India, with an average annual rainfall of 63 centimeters. 30% more rain over 150% more area. Of the rainwaters that India receives annually, about 450 billion cubic meters recharge the groundwater resources, and about 2,000 billion cubic meters flows through the rivers of India. This statement may require a review because the groundwater replenishing happens only if there are forests. The forest cover of India has got depleted during the last several decades, and which has to be redone if only we need to absorb the water that has fallen from the heavens. The rivers of China carry about 2,600 billion cubic meters of water, and those of USA 1,700 billion cubic meters of water. Thus, the bounty that India receives from the rains is comparable to the most bounteous and much larger regions of the world. And India is very rich in biological diversity. India supports an extraordinarily great variety of flora and fauna. There are about 45,000 species of plants, including shrubs, in the country. 45,000 species. Of the 35% of these, 35% are endemic to India and are not found anywhere else in the world. This makes India one amongst the countries with highest diversity of vegetation in the world. India supports 75,000 species of animals, birds, and insects. This forms 1/12 of the known fauna on the earth. Though, in terms of geographical area, we are only 1/40th of earth. India is also known to be very rich in the variety of microorganisms it supports. All this is true and maintainable only if we have large forest cover, green cover over the earth. Minerals. India has abundant, widespread, and excellent deposits of iron ore. Proven reserves of iron ore amount to 12 billion tons. At our present level of production, these reserves suffice for 300 years. We have 220 billion tons of coal and lignite. Indian coal has somewhat high ash content, but the reserves are large enough to last for 750 years at the present level of exploitation. Amongst the newer metals, India has one of the largest deposits of bauxite, the ore from which aluminium is produced. Indian reserves of titanium ore, ilmenite, and the largest in the world. More than 1/3 of the world's proven resources of ilmenite are in India. Indian deposits of rare earths are second only to that of China. We have large thorium reserves amounting to 360,000 tons. These reserves are sufficient to establish a nuclear energy capacity of 1 million megawatts, that is 1 trillion watts, and sustain it for 240 years. India has awe-inspiring land. India has inspired people to make observations which have lasted till date. In the Greek accounts of the campaigns of Alexander, who till then seemed to be passing through almost barren expanses, suddenly begins to encounter one populous kingdom after another, each one strongly defended by its brave people, and the mood of the narrator changes to that of an awe at the fertility of the lands, the greatness of the rivers, the strength and intelligence of the animals, and the bravery of the multitudinous people. Megasthenes, the Greek writer, Pliny, Strabo, and other Greek and Roman authors who wrote about India all reflect this sense of awe. Even Herodotus, the renowned Greek historian, refers to India as the most populous nation in the known world. The later accounts of Chinese traveler Fahian and Huan San, who visited India at the time of the Guptas and Harshavardhana, respectively, are also pervaded by the same sense of awe at the immensity and affluence of the Indian lands and her people. So the Indian land is in a splendid isolation, covered and protected by the Himalayas on the north and the seas in the south. It is not approachable for the enemies except in the northwest passes, the Khyber and the Bolan passes. In the north, of course, Himalaya will not allow that. And in the northeast also, huge wild forests do not allow any invader to bring his army. So, and from the seas, it is well protected by the 3 seas around it. Samudra Vasane Devi. And therefore, was in a splendid isolation for a prolonged period of time, fostered by the rivers, a very fertile land, a great civilization flourished here. The human resource of excellent quality, this happens because of the culture. The Indian population remained the highest in the world till 1700 AD, with Chinese being a close second. Farista in 1600 AD estimated the Indian population prior to 1100 AD at 600 million. 60 crores in 1180. This is what Farishta said. Maybe right, may not be very right, but it is not a small number at all. When the total population of European world, according to the estimates of Western scholars, was merely 100 million. Kautilya's Arthashastra says that a grama should have at least 100 households. And according to many classical texts, India consisted of 5 lakh gramas. Today, if you compare it, today it is not 5 lakhs, it is 6,38,000 villages. This means that Indian population in normal times, in the classical ages, was at least around 50 million households, or about 500 million people, if the Indian ideal of 8 children per family is taken seriously. This may not be true, but even half of that number is an enormous number if you count Kautilya's time, that is 320 BC. Irrigation and agriculture both go hand in hand, and India was very conscious of this, that it needs to do the best with the facilities that are available as the best in the world. The sun shines over almost the whole of India throughout the year, allowing us to grow crops around the year. Almost everyone in India, and certainly in the fertile plains and river valleys of India, it is possible to grow 2 crops in a year, and with effort even 3. There is hardly any other region in the world where this is possible over such a large area. In China, just 1 crop can be grown a year in the northern half of the cultivable zone. Only in the tropical zone in the south can China grow 5 crops in 2 years. That is 2.5 crops per year. As is possible in almost the whole of India. The land, including the Himalayas, the sun and the waters in India seem to have combined together in a rare synthesis to make it the richest agricultural region of the world. And the kings and the rulers of our ancient times were conscious of their duties towards agriculture. See, this is from the ancient times. One is Ramayana, other is Mahabharata. Indian civilization has from ancient times imposed upon the kings and the people the responsibility to carefully tend to the wells, canals, and tanks so that the agriculture is not left merely to the mercy of the rain gods. In the Ramayana, Sri Rama asked Bharata to ensure that agriculture in Kosala does not become Deva Matrika, dependent on the rains alone. And in the Mahabharata, Narada Maharshi solicitously asked Yudhishthira, this is when he came to advise him to do Rajasuya. So the initial talk is about the well-being of the public, etc. Says Narada, have you ensured that in every part of the land, large irrigation tanks have been constructed, that these are brimming with water, and that agriculture is not left to the mercy of the gods of rain alone? See, the awareness passes through our scriptures and our kavyas. In every period of Indian history, great kings of India have constructed great irrigation works. The legendary Karikala Chola of the Sangama period, the exact period is not known. They call it Sangama period in Tamil Nadu. It must have been more than 2000 years ago. Karikala Chola constructed Kallanai, the Grand Anekat. Anekat is nothing but a dam. At the point where the river Kolidam branches off from Kaveri. The Anekat is the lifeline of the rich and fertile Kaveri Valley even today. According to an inscription of the 1st century AD, the Shaka Rudradamana of Junagadh got the vast Sudarshana lake near Girinar repaired. The lake is known to have been constructed by the Mauryas. This is Alexander Walker, as a visitor to the country around 1850, who visited several regions of India, both Malabar and Gujarat. I'm quoting some of them. The book quotes some of them. In Malabar, the knowledge of husbandry, that is agriculture, seems as ancient as their history. It is the favorite employment of the inhabitants. It is endeared to them by their mode of life and the property which they possess in the soil. It is a theme for their writers. It is a subject in which they delight to converse, and with which all ranks profess to be acquainted. They have provided a code of rules of good husbandry. A system is laid down for the proper cultivation of soils. There is cultivated in Malabar upwards of 50 kinds of rice. See the variety. They are each distinguished by a separate name, by some peculiar quality, and different modes of cultivation are of course pursued. Some kinds grow on the hills and do not require irrigation. There is one species which is propagated by cuttings, a mode which I never heard of except in Malabar. The same gentleman visited Gujarat, and he says, in Gujarat, the divisions of land are seldom very large and are of unequal sizes according to the judgment, interest, and taste of the proprietor. They are remarkably neat, kept clean, and well dressed. These fields have frequently broad grassy margins which are left for pasture, such as are seen in some parts of Yorkshire. The whole world does not produce finer and more beautifully cultivated fields than those in Gujarat. In the neighborhood of towns, they are commonly planted at the edge with fruit and other trees. This gives them the appearance of our hedgerows, and they must be compared to the finest parts of England. This appearance is not peculiar to Gujarat. It may be found in many other countries, that is parts of India. This is 19th century. Now the watering system of South India. He says the Indian technical ingenuity is that it can be best seen in the tank irrigation system of South India. The whole of South India is dotted with those tanks. The whole of South India is dotted with those tanks. It is a network of tanks. The tanks are arranged in such a way that if there is an overflow from one, it will go to the next tank. A British expert writing in the 1850s estimated the total number of such tanks in the Madras presidency to be over 50,000. Almost every village is expected to have a tank. Another estimate indicated that in the 18th century, there were more than 38,000 tanks in the region that later constituted the Mysore state. The state had an area of around 29,000 square miles, but they had 38,000 tanks. That is 1 square mile, 1 tank. It is therefore a fair estimate that there were over 1 lakh tanks in the whole of South India. These tanks were constructed and maintained by local effort. Together they form a closely knit whole, so that the outflow from the one at a higher level supplied the one at a lower level, and so on. This chain of tanks was so complete and interrelated within itself that British engineers of the 19th century felt that it would have been impossible to add another tank to the chain or to take out one from it. It was so complete, the entire land mass covered by these tanks, interconnected tanks, network of tanks. This is groundwater engineering. Now, naturally, when this whole country is according an importance to agriculture of certain level, of this kind of a level, the yields were exceptionally good. So there is some data here tabulated. It says for during various centuries, 900 to 1200, 1100, 1300, 1800, 1800, 1700, 1900, etc. The last one is 30 years ago. So around 1000, year 1000, Tanjavur, based on the inscriptions, it reads as though it is 15 to 18 tons of paddy. Compare it with the current yield of 4.3 tons of wheat plus 5.8 tons of paddy. But this is Ludhiana, that is Tanjavur. Yeah. But certainly, compared to today, the yield was better. In South Arcot in 1100, it was 14.5 tons of paddy per hectare. In Ramanathapuram, 1325, 20 tons of paddy per hectare. In the 19th century beginning, Coimbatore, see, this is the time when the British land reforms, you can call it reforms or alterations or whatever, the taxation policies started taking effect. And even then, in Coimbatore, it was 13 tons of paddy per hectare. 1803, Allahabad, it was 7 tons of wheat plus a cereal crop. 1770, a little earlier, is the beginning of the British rule in Chengalpattu. Chengalpattu is the outskirts of Chennai, not rated as the great plateau for agriculture. It was 9 tons of paddy. And today in Punjab, according to Government of India reports, it is 4.3 tons of wheat per hectare plus 5.5 tons of paddy. Totally about 10 tons. That is the richness of the Indian land. And compare this to the load of people on the land, the consumers. The number of people per arable hectare of land in India today is almost the same as in Europe and much less than that in China and Japan. China and Japan is much higher than the ratio of India. Only very sparsely populated regions of the world like the USA, the former USSR and Australia have considerably lesser people per arable hectare of land than us. And since we are blessed with the perennial rivers and perennial sunshine, and we can grow 2 crops in a year, almost everywhere in the country, each hectare of arable land in India is potentially equal to 2 hectares almost anywhere else in the world. This table will tell us what is it across the world. In the world, people in the world average is 4 people in 1990 per hectare. That is the load. It was 1.9 in 1950, but 4 in 1990. Compared to that world average, India has 5.1 today. It was 2.2 in 1950. But compare it with China. China, it is 12.2 per hectare, whereas India is 5.1 per hectare. So the load is more than double in China and 6 times in Japan, 30.2. That means they don't have much of a land and they have to import grains. Only USA and USSR are lighter than India. Other things are comparable. Maybe Africa is 3.9. It is lighter. Africa, USA, and USSR are lighter than India. Now, the home industry in India, India was industrial, but it is a gharelu industry. It is a home industry. Part of the family will look at the agriculture and part will concentrate on industry in small scale. Textiles formed the great industrial enterprise of pre-British India. Up to 1800, India was the world's leading producer and exporter of textiles. China was a close second. Spinning of yarn was an activity in which perhaps the whole of India participated. According to an observer from Manchester, Arnaud Persay, who visited India in 1930 to study its cotton industry, there were 5 crore spinning wheels intermittently at work even then. By then, this industry was almost completely reduced to penury. He is talking about 1930s. Even then, 5 crore spinning wheels intermittently at work even then. And this simple small wheel was so efficient that till the early decades of the 19th century, a widowed mother could still maintain a whole family in reasonable manner by spinning on the charkha for a few hours a day. In the early decades of 19th century. In fact, by the third decade of 19th century, things started deteriorating in Bengal, elsewhere, and we have seen some quotations earlier on that. A widowed mother complains that she is not able to maintain her family. Weaving was relatively more specialized activity. However, the number of those belonging to the weaver caste was smaller in comparison only to those from the cultivating caste. Various estimates indicate that the weavers formed more than 5% of the Indian population. Early 19th century data for certain districts of South India indicate that there were about 20,000 looms in a district on the average. 20,000 looms in a district. Persay in 1930 estimated the number of handlooms operating in India to be in the vicinity of 20 lakhs across the country. That means if there are 5 lakh villages, at least 4 looms per village. Iron smelting was an accomplished industry in India before the British came. Scores of European accounts of Indian manufacture of iron and steel refer to almost 100 districts spread all over India. It is estimated that the number of furnaces in India towards the latter half of the 18th century was over 10,000. 10,000 furnaces in the latter half of the 18th century. And these had the potential to produce 2 lakh tons of iron annually. Throughout history, Indian steel has been renowned in the world for its extraordinary high quality and sophistication. And this dates back to the time when Alexander came to India. Alexander of Macedonia was proud of having received 100 talents of steel from Pururavas of Takshashila in the 4th century BC. The West was acquainted with the Indian iron and steel fairly early through the celebrated Damascus swords, which were invariably forged from the famed Indian Wootz steel. Wootz, the original word was perhaps Ukku in Kannada. Ukku. And we all know about this iron pillar of Mehrauli, which is a wonder. The quality of iron that is produced, it stands as a testimony for more than 1,500 years. The iron pillar of Mehrauli in Delhi has dazzled metallurgists with its sheer size and its resistance to corrosion. The pillar is 24.25 feet high and has a diameter of 16 inches, 16.4 inches at the base. It weighs 6 tons and it has withstood the ravages of time for more than 1,500 years without any visible sign of rusting or decay. Metallurgists of the world have marveled at the sophistication of smelting and iron making technology that could produce an iron of such quality and in such size. And they have wondered at the skills of the foundry and erection that allowed the Indians to forge such a large and heavy piece of metal at that early age. Looking at the iron pillar of Delhi, a late 19th century British observer remarked in 1881, "It is not many years since the production of such a pillar would have been an impossibility in the largest foundries of the world. And even now, there are comparatively few places where similar mass of metal could be turned out." This was in 1881, more than 100 years after the onset of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Now the sharing part. Sharing and caring has been the cultural value ingrained in this society. It has a philosophical background. But that is the sustaining part. The fabric of society was sustained by the culture of this country. Family is the basic unit of the society. Family, the Indian family system, its value system, is one of the great accomplishments of our civilization, our culture. The primary responsibility of caring for all aspects of creation in the Indian civilization perspective is placed upon the Grihastha, the responsible and capable householder. The Mahabharata says that hundreds and thousands of moving and unmoving creatures in the universe live off what the Grihastha earns through his righteous actions. And the kings ministers, soldiers, and scholars all depend upon the grihastha for their sustenance. That is why they say dhanyo grihastha shrama. The grihastha, the householder, along with his family and not the individual, forms the basic unit of Indian social, economic, and moral order. It is important to note this distinction or this value. The value is upon the family, not upon the individual. Individual is not the basic unit as seen by Indian civilization. It is the family. The social, economic, and moral responsibilities of the grihastha are discharged by all members of the household jointly. But the woman of the house is central to the household. Mahabharata says that the woman is the household. Na griham grihamityahu. Grihini grihamuchyate. House is not a house without the grihini. Grihini herself is the house. The Vedas say that she is the queen of the household. The centrality of woman in an Indian household is brought out poignantly by Draupadi's description of her role in the Pandava household. The exalted place of the woman in the Indian household and consequently in the Indian social, economic, and moral order has remained unchanged over time. We have seen this Draupadi's description in our last session. Sharing. Sanatana Dharma enjoins upon every responsible and capable householder to take out appropriate shares for all aspects of creation that fall within his care. He has not only feed his family members, but also guests, announced and unannounced guests, not only guests, but the animals and birds around. He has to keep shares for all aspects of creation that fall within his care to assuage the hunger of all before sitting down to eat for himself. Those who fail to care and share thus are, from the Indian civilization perspective, no better than thieves. Stena eva saha, says Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. Ishopanishad teaches them that whatever there is in the universe is pervaded by God alone, and therefore one may partake of whatever he gets only after sharing it with others. So the mandate is Tena Tyaktena Bhunjita Kasyas Vidhanam. Don't covet others' wealth. Whatever you have, share it with people, animals, birds, reptiles, and then eat. Sharing is endemic to this culture. This is an observation by Fahian, who visited India in 400 AD, during the Gupta period. And then there is another observation by a lady from Australia, a writer from Australia in 1997 AD. Two observations, distant apart, something like 1600 years. The first one, the nobles and householders of this country have founded hospitals within the city. Talking about Magadha. To which the poor of all countries, the destitutes, the cripples, and the deceased may repair. They receive every kind of requisite help gratuitously. Physicians inspect their diseases and, according to their cases, order them food and drink, medicine and decoctions. Everything, in fact, that may contribute to their ease. Food, drink, medicine, decoctions, etc. When cured, they depart at their ease. This is Fahian recording the Gupta period. Now Germaine Greer from Australia, a feminist writer, well-known writer, who came to India in 1997, says, a sannyasi can walk from one end of the subcontinent to the other with nothing but a loincloth, his staff, and a begging bowl, because people will share what little they have with him. In the shabby lanes of urban Bombay, at supper time, you may see scores of poor men sitting on the pavements outside the restaurants, waiting for their free meal of rice and dal, cooked for them by the restaurant, paid for by the clients. Grama and Sampradaya. There are social, the polity, society organizing its polity using certain entities called the Grama, the Sampradaya, the community, etc. And of all this, the household is a unit. It is not individuals, it is the household, the family. The grahasthas from the myriad groupings around the locality, the profession, the kinship community, or the religious faith. Groups are formed around this idea, the profession, the community, and the religion. But the membership is for the family. In the Indian perspective, all these spontaneous and organic formations of the society are taken to be inherently legitimate participants in the public affairs. All these partake of the attributes of the state. It is their politics, it is their polity. In fact, the activities of these groups of the community, the group, a social group, the grama, the geographical group based on the geography, and the sampradaya based on the lineage, hereditary, in their respective domains and their mutual interactions constitute public polity in the Indian sense. So the villages are conducted by these groupings. And the maintenance of public order and provision of social security, two of the most elaborate and expensive functions of the modern state, are performed largely by the family, the community, the grama, and the sampradaya. It is organized at the village level. This is why India today is one of the least policed countries in the world. Please note this point. It is one of the least policed countries in the world. And yet, the rate of violent crime in India is amongst the lowest. The family, community, grama, and the sampradaya also continue to take care of the elderly, the sick, and the destitute. These functions in modern states consume almost 1/3 of the gross national product of nations. Community and grama form the nucleus of the state. This is a table which lists the crime rate across the world. See, the second column indicates crime, violent crime per 100,000 people in 1997. 100,000, 1 lakh people. In USA, it is 439.2. Whereas in India, it is 4.6. Look at the numbers. It is staggering, really. UK it is 364, Germany 112, France 103, Russia 67, Japan 15, Indonesia 6, China 5.6, India 4.6. If you just take, if you normalize it against India, if you take it as 1, USA it is 95.5. 1 to 95. That is the ratio. 100 times roughly. But the number of police stations, I could get the numbers in India as well as in the US. See, the US number of population is only 1/4 of India, but the extent is 3 times. The land extent is 3 times. And it has 17,985. That is 18,000 police stations. Whereas in India, it is only 16,000 police stations. Okay. And if you take the ratio of Indian number of police stations to the number of villages, in India there are 6,38,000 villages, whereas 16,600 police stations. The ratio is 1:38. 1 police station for 38 villages. That is the average. Of course, I have not counted the cities in this. If you deduct the cities part, separate them, it may be 1 in 50. So 50 villages, 1 police station. But yet the crime rate is one of the lowest. This is not the gift of the state. It is the gift of the civilization. Civilization, cultural values. India is a culture which essentially values one's own conscience, the Sakshi. Therefore, most Indians are self-governed. They don't need someone else to tell you. Most, I'm not saying that all are, but the bulk of Indians, the trend is determined by the bulk of the society. They are self-governed. Therefore, the violence is much lower here. In spite of the fact, policing is much lower. This is a cultural value. And the king, traditionally, India was ruled by monarchy mostly. There were republics even during the time of Chanakya. If you see the serial, he visits several republics and talks to the public in a democratic manner, participates and talks. And there were at least 22 republics during the time of Chandragupta. But that was a small number, but yet the seed was still there of democracy and republics. Largely it was governed by the monarchy, but the king was inspired by dharma. And it is said these are the responsibilities of the king. Dushtasya dandaha, sujanasya puja, and then collect funds, then dispense it on dharma. So he is there above this grama, sampradaya and the community as a supervisor. The duty of the king who sits at the apex of this self-generating and self-governing polity is to guarantee harmonious functioning of these diverse groupings and institutions of the society in their different domains and roles, and to protect the society from external aggression. This is one of the major responsibilities of the king. He has to protect. Defense is his domain. The king presents the forbidding face of the society to the outsiders. That face assumes as an aspect of benign non-intervention when turned inwards. People manage themselves at the village level and the king doesn't interfere on that. Only if there is a dispute, he interferes. But he takes responsibility for protecting his people in the villages. The Janapadas. and the cities. With respect to the society, the king has no legislative or coercive power. Please notice this. He has no legislative or coercive power. His role is to protect the discipline inherent in various organic groups of the society, to protect Desha Dharma, Jati Dharma, and Kula Dharma of various groups. In fact, along with Praja Rakshana, protection of the people, the other major attribute of the king in Indian civilizational perspective is Loka Ranjana, keeping the society in good humor. The Indian term for the king, Raja, is derived from this Ranjana aspect of the kingship. Ranjayate iti Raja. Indians living securely within their vast and fertile lands for millennia without fear of external aggression or internal scarcity developed into a homogeneous civilizational area. This homogeneous civilization of India is anchored in the Sanatana Dharma. Living in their splendid and rich isolation, Indians have been at peace with themselves. Not only with themselves, but with nature and with the world. The Sanatana Dharma enshrines at its heart a sense of deep respect for all aspects of creation. This respect for all creation and the urge to live in harmony with all is the defining characteristic of Sanatana Dharma and therefore of Indianness. The deep-seated Indian sense of respect for all creation is anchored in and flows from the Indian view of the universe as a manifestation of Brahman. Every Indian is aware of the Indian view of the world as play of Brahman, which is called Leela, and of the supremacy of Kala in this play, that is Karma. Every Indian thus is imbued with a sense of responsible kinship with all aspects of creation, with an awareness of divinity in all sentient and insentient beings that needs to be not only respected and worshipped, but also nurtured and cared. Others have seen gross idolatry in this Indian way of seeing divinity in creation. Indians see in this the only possible way of responsible living on earth. So the last point, this is an observation of an outsider, Kingsley Davis, in 1951. Kingsley Davis was an American sociologist, very highly rated, highly respected. He was honored with the Outstanding Sociologist Award for the 20th century. Not a decade, but for a century. So this is the observation of Kingsley Davis. He says, India's long geographical isolation explains the uniqueness of Indian culture. Indian ideas and institutions taken as a whole resemble those of no other people. It is unique, distinctive, attributed only to India. They have a peculiar shape and flavor of their own. They have tended to transform and absorb any foreign element that trickled into the region. For India, though politically conquered by outsiders, was never culturally conquered. This is an observation in 1951. after studying the Indian society, he says, politically conquered, but was never culturally conquered. This peculiar culture has to some degree penetrated and pervaded nearly every part of what is geographically India. It has everywhere been affected by local indigenous variations. I call it unity in diversity. But neither the geographical nor the social barriers inside the subcontinent have been sufficient to prevent the widespread diffusion of a common basic culture, which, despite great variation, is peculiarly Indian. Okay, that is it. So I have concluded this presentation. If you have any questions or comments, I would be happy to hear.
Thank you, sir. So, anybody having questions, please come forward. No, my only comment, sir, is yeah, this is a very good viewpoint of Indian civilization. But what is typically taught even in schools is a very negative view of Indian civilization. Even when it comes to women, what you told about household this thing, whereas what we study in school and all is women are treated badly, secondary and all that. So that is the 180-degree uh, opposite viewpoint.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, this is what our history books say because the history books were written by certain people with certain mindset. But in spite of that, see, what we need to take from Indian civilization is how do we reconstruct our society in future. What has been said in this book is it's a well researched, thoroughly researched documentation, well supported of the status of Indian society in the realistic terms, in the sense keeping the invaders outside your mind. What is real India? So we need to reconstruct our society on the lines which are generally indicated by the Sanatana Dharma. That's what comes out through the book. So it again boils down to the paradigmical viewpoint. Yeah, today's history books do not record all this. What we study in the school are not record, which need to be changed.
Right, sir. It's not just history. The way they talk about the society itself, about
Yeah,
many of the
correct.
aspects that you touched about, it is a very
Yeah,
negative viewpoint.
correct. This is dominated, the public discourse is dominated by three different paradigms, right? So they view it that way. That is a Marxian viewpoint, but we'll have to somehow overcome that. We'll have to understand our culture and spread it so that our people become more vocal and counter them appropriately and do that. Now, I agree with your point. I am contesting that, but then these people have started a study which is very good. This Center for Policy Studies. There are other books of similar kind looking at the cultural value system. Of course, one we have already seen. I agree with your points.
So, Anand, do you have any comment or question?
No question, but just a comment, actually, just observation, because we talk about these books, right? Textbooks, and how we need to write it in a proper fashion. Actually, the thing is, I bumped into an institute from Mumbai actually in the last few months, and it was very strange. Actually, I had attended their talk on forts in Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh. So I thought they were just another good organization to. So I was on their WhatsApp group, but I realized that it's a ultra leftist group. Actually, it's very strange, and they actually want they don't like this new policy of the government, which is the UGC policy. I think Modi has put out, right, to change a little bit. I mean, a very small change in textbooks, but these people are ultra leftist, and I mean, we can carbon copy see. I mean, why these things happened in India. I mean, there are so many of these people, and this group from Mumbai, they are having weekly talks, and they talk about iconography and all this Indian culture, but completely diametrically opposite from how you will be presenting. So just wanted to give that comment that there are such organizations in India, and I'm sure there are more, but just wanted to let you know. Yeah.
Okay.
Sir, any comments? But I agree with you, Anand. Yeah, I'm also familiar with some groups. In fact, they call themselves reading groups and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And underlying, it's always like there are these other people. I mean, they have a completely different mindset actually. And initially, they will have very nice words around it, like spreading the knowledge and all that stuff. But you have to be very careful. I mean, I actually accidentally bumped into them, like I told you. I actually joined their WhatsApp because of some other reason.
Okay.
But thanks for the information. Yeah, I will try to look up the book. I guess I assume it is. You might have mentioned. I might have missed it. It's available, right, on the internet. I assume.
Which one?
And the one that you talked about, this Timeless India.
Yeah,
Sir,
it is available.
Yeah.
It is available online for online reading. You can read it
Yeah.
directly from their website.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, you can buy it also.
Okay, sir. So, okay, with that comment, we come to the end of the session. So we end the session with a Shanti Mantra.
Okay, thank you.
Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah. Sarve Santu Niramaya. Sarve Bhadrani Paschyantu. Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. So thank you, sir. Thanks to everyone who attended the session today.